I walk a straight line, shackled and chained. Oh, gruesome Gertie is calling my name. There is no mercy in this penitentiary. Just ask the Hill String Gang or Angola 3. I'm here for life, I'm here to die. Inside these walls, inside the wire. And when the wolf cries, I know it's over. Oh, bloody Angola. Oh, bloody Angola.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bloody Angola, a podcast 142 years in the making, the complete story of America's bloodiest prison. I'm your host, Jim Chapman. I'm dropping this episode on Thanksgiving Eve, and hopefully you're out there with family and friends, you're cooking it up, and maybe even listening to Bloody Angola. I'm absolutely thankful for every single one of you who, like me, share a unique interest in historic prisons, the criminal mind, and all that encompasses that. So from me to all of you, thank you so much for hanging in there and staying with me. Now today I'm continuing with the story of Felix Vail. And the last time that I left you, Felix Vail had finally been arrested for the murder of his wife, Mary, which occurred some 50 years prior to his arrest on May 18th of 2013. And Felix was 73, y'all, at the time of his arrest. Now, Vail was arrested in Canyon Lake, Texas. Undercover cops actually waited for him outside of his home. They were doing kind of a stakeout, but when he didn't arrive there, they put out an APB and he was actually arrested at a local post office. And his statement upon his arrest was, "I don't know why this is happening." That's all he said. He actually waived extradition to Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana, and they drove him straight there from his arrest. And that arrest was significant. This was to be the oldest prosecution of a serial killer in a cold case in the entire history of the United States. Now, what prompted his arrest is an interesting story in and of itself. An investigative reporter for a Jackson, Mississippi newspaper called the Clarion Ledger. His name was Jerry Mitchell, and he started investigating this case again, kind of on his own in 2012. That investigation led him to publish a special report titled Gone in that local paper, and that in turn prompted authorities to open a case up of their own. So I cannot overemphasize how big of a role that Jerry Mitchell played in this case. As a matter of fact, were it not for Jerry Mitchell and that report, Felix Vail would have never been arrested or convicted in his wife Mary's death. And another large bit of credit goes to Annette's mother, Rose, who never gave up on her own pursuit of justice after her teenage daughter had went missing while being married to Vail. So what was Vail up to between the years of 1985, where I last left you in episode 1, and 2013, when he was finally arrested? Well, I'm going to give you the rest of the story through the eyes of the guy who really deserves all of the credit, and that is Jerry Mitchell and his account of the details. And I'm going to pick up in 1987 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, Rose at this point is fed up with the lack of progress in her daughter's death. She had spent thousands of dollars by this time on private investigators, and she was trying to start a new life. She had just started a new job at a bakery. She fired all those private investigators that seemed to lead nowhere, and she decided to look for Vail herself. So she put some information out there. She's looking for this guy, and she actually got tipped off. Someone told her he was staying at a house, and she got her friend, and they go to that house, and they actually see him sitting outside. Imagine that. After all these years of looking for this guy, there he is, sitting outside on the front porch of a house. So she walks up to him and she says, "Where did Annette go?" And he said, "Mexico." And she said, "Where in Mexico?" And so Vail told her that he and Annette had made a pact that they would contact each other after 5 years. He never looked up at her. He never stood up. He never looked her mother in the eye. And shocked, she just walked away, shaking her head in disbelief. She didn't believe a word of what he had said. Now, Vail became fast friends with a native of Tulsa, Oklahoma by the name of Scott Porter. And he was an expert in martial arts, had like a ton of black belts. And Vail believed he was a martial arts expert too, after practicing flying kicks into a mattress. Each morning, he and Porter, they would work out. They would lift weights together before hitting a Chinese buffet. Over lunch, Vail had shared with this guy that he had never felt he was bound by society rules. As a matter of fact, Porter recalled he dropped his silverware and began eating with his hands like a caveman. And at nights, the pair would play pool, they would drink beer, and they would sometimes visit strip clubs in Tulsa. Porter was quoted as saying, "Tulsa has more churches than gas stations, but also more strip clubs than anywhere else I've lived." The two men reminisced about the women missing from their lives. Vail, at 45, had been married to Annette, just 18, if you'll remember, and Porter, at 28, had dated Rose, who was 36. That's right. They dated mom and daughter at one point in their lives. Porter had driven Rose to California before returning home alone, and he said, "My heart was absolutely broken. She needed to move on, and I didn't." Now, not long after Annette had vanished, Rose telephoned Porter and shared some of her suspicions that Vail had something to do with her daughter's disappearance. Porter began examining each word his friend spoke. While he discussed his hopes of reuniting with Rose, he noticed Vail never mentioned the possibility of reuniting with Annette. One night, Vail seemed more open. He was crying like a baby, Porter recalled, angry it didn't work out differently. Vail explained that Annette wanted to recreate herself and that she didn't want any contact with any portion of her past life. She wanted to totally break with herself. Now, while Vail talked of breaking with the past, Porter, he was busy searching for his. He had been adopted and decided to move to Minnesota to reconnect with his birth parents. And while there, he met his future wife, Jenny. Returning to Oklahoma with a small son and another on the way, he renewed his friendship with Vail, who was so kind he later watched the boys while the couple went out on dates. Once, during a discussion of fidelity, Porter said Vail shared that he felt nobody could ever be faithful to one person. Months later, Vail started hitting on my wife, Porter said. Upset about this, he took Vail on a walk and confronted him, and of course, Vail denied it all. Porter recalled, he said, no, she was hitting on me. As they crossed the Arkansas River Bridge, a fleeting thought ran through his head. I wanted to throw Felix off that bridge and was wondering if I'd get away with it. Now, after these incidents, Vail began dating someone by the name of Beth Field. She was attracted to his intelligence and the pair grew close. Then, during a December 1987 argument, he became so violent he ruptured her eardrum. She told Vail there was no justification for physical violence, and she said he replied, "If you quit behaving like a whore, I'll quit hitting you." She recalled discussing the issue with a therapist. "I finally told this woman it's all very nice, but one of us is going to be dead before this works. Field eventually took the advice of a close friend and attended an intensive 10-day mediation course in August of 1988 on Colorado's western slope. To her surprise, Vail came too. After the course, she received a telephone call from Rose sharing details about the disappearance of her daughter Annette. From that point forward, Field said she began to examine Vail's words more closely, realizing the probability that he had taken Annette's life. He told Field he and Annette had gone camping and that she wanted to get away from her mother and that he had helped her set up an opportunity for her to change her name and move on. Vail denied to her any involvement in Annette's disappearance. Then, one time she recalled, he said, "What if I said yes?" 4 months after the mediation course, he entered her home unannounced. Already drunk, he accused her of imagined promiscuity, according to the court order. He slapped her, he struck her, and he threw her across the bedroom. She asked if he was going to kill her, and he said, "It depends on what you tell me." So the judge, hearing all this information, he gave her a protective order, and he required Vail to keep his distance. 2 weeks later, the sheriff reported that Vail was nowhere to be found. Field said she was caught in a sick, addictive relationship, and it took quite some time to fully unravel. Over time, her attachment to him, it began to fade. And while Field was visiting a mediation center again in Texas, this was in 1990, Vail arrived and chastised her. She felt the same anger and defensiveness rising up as before, she said. She walked away to compose herself, and when she returned, she sat down next to him. I told him, "There is a part of you that goes off, and it's sick and it's dangerous." She said he looked at her and said, "Really?" "Yes, really." This time, the message seemed to sink in. Vail left the next day, and with a single exception of about 5 years later, she never saw him again. Now, Mary Rose, she moved to Ashland, Oregon. This was in 1989, and she was working as an administrator for a private school. She was hoping for a quieter life, obviously, than the one she had in California. More than a year later, she goes and she visits a psychic, and she asked if she could talk to her daughter, Annette. The psychic put her hands over her forehead and spoke. "Oh my gosh, this is not something I usually talk about when I see images like this." She never shared what she saw, but Rose knew her daughter was dead and that she needed to get to the bottom of it. So in the summer of 1991, she removed the back seats from her Toyota van and put in a makeshift bed for sleeping. She actually made curtains to hang over the windows. She had previously talked by phone with Felix Vail's sister, Sue Jordan, who now lived in Canyon Lake, Texas. So Rose decided to drive more than 2,000 miles there, hoping she might find out more in person. So Jordan answered the door. She invited her in, and the two women, they sit in the living room. And Jordan recalled the last time she saw Annette. That was in October of 1984 when the family attended a fair in Sulphur, Louisiana. She said Vail was there and Annette. And she told Annette's mom that Felix was giving Annette a hard time. He criticized the way she was dressed. He was just very rude to her. Days after the fair, the couple left together. And a few days after that, Vail returned alone. He looked extremely distressed and he was drinking a lot. Jordan also said that Vail told her Annette had wanted to leave and that he took her to a bus station and that she left with some Mexican men heading to Mexico. Jordan also mentioned that Vail's first wife had drowned, which Rose by this point did not know. And before she left, Jordan said, "Oh, there was another woman that disappeared. I remember her mother calling my mother for years, checking to see if they'd heard from her. I think her name was Sharon." Now, after this conversation, Rose sits down at a typewriter and she basically logged every word she could remember from that conversation, knowing she may need it later. She also called a public library in Lake Charles. That librarian remembered the 1962 drowning of Vail's first wife, Mary. And that librarian recalled that he had taken out life insurance policies on his wife prior to her drowning. She also said the insurance companies were suspicious and didn't pay the full value. The librarian made some copies of the newspaper articles and actually mailed them to Annette's mother. After reading them, Rose reached out to Mary's family in Louisiana, and she spoke to Will Horton, which was Mary's brother. He shared the suspicions he had about Vail and also a copy of a 1971 National Enquirer article. When she read it, she knew that Sharon's last name was Hensley. So that solved one problem, but created another. Where was Sharon Hensley from? She didn't have any idea. She had never heard of her. In 1994, she read in the newspaper about Dolores Strullo's disappearance from Medford, Oregon, 7 years earlier. Police had just arrested her husband thanks to the work of a detective by the name of Terry Newell. So she got an idea. She figured if this guy could do that, maybe he can help me. She contacted Newell, and he was able to help her find the family of Sharon Hensley. So when Rose dialed Hensley's family, Sharon's mother, Peggy, answered. The first question Rose asked, "Do you happen to know who Felix Vail is?" "You bet I do," Sharon Hensley's mother said back. And Rose replied, "We need to talk." Now, at this time, Vail was living with his mother and father in their home in Montpelier, Mississippi. During the day, he would work some on the family farm, and he also tinkered with his Fiat, which is a car for you young people out there, and used his gravity boots to hang upside down in the barn. One day, he actually chased off a three-legged hound dog, he wrote in his journal. Remember, I told you he liked the journal. The next day, he wrote, "I shot the three-legged dog and cleaned up the garbage." He detailed in his journal about winning pool games and screwing women, sometimes having sex in a grain bin, an old bus, or their homes while their husbands were away. This was in 1992. Also in 1992, Robin Sinclair, she telephoned a Mississippi newspaper wanting to buy an advertisement to remind Vail that he had a daughter he had never met. The newspaper put her in touch with Vail, and the two began writing letters back and forth and talking on the telephone. In one note, Vail stated he had never gotten over me, she recalled. She felt confused by his words, she said, because she said she was already living with a man who made her happy and who would be her future husband. When Vail arrived a few months later, she said the same magic she had felt with him more than 20 years earlier had vanished. "I realized that he was a fraud, a bum, and kind of a joke." So during this time, Mary Rose, she had contacted everyone she could think of, even the FBI, and the detective who had helped her before, Terry Newell, he contacted Jim Bell, a national expert in serial killings who actually worked for the FBI. And when Rose talked with Bell, she felt like she had hit the jackpot. He was interested in working on Vail's case if he could swing the time. He was busy. Serial killers seemed to be active during that time in history. Now, Vail's son, Bill, he told Rose that he was willing to testify as long as authorities provided protection to his family. Both the Tulsa police and the district attorney's office in Lake Charles, they revived their investigations into Vail, now considered a suspected serial killer. And Bell suggested the victims' families gather with authorities at the FBI Academy in Virginia to share that information on Vail. He was unable to work on the case and left the FBI in 1995. The meeting in Quantico never materialized, and the case involving Vail grew cold yet again. So obviously Rose is devastated. She had worked so hard to make something happen, and nothing had happened. She knew that other families felt devastated too. Now, in the mid-1990s, Vail began dating a woman in Mississippi. At the time, he was 55 and she was 44. "In 10 years, I never saw a temper," the woman said. She recalled Vail taking care of his parents before their deaths, and she described him as very attentive. She said he was just a kind man. Although he never worked a job, She said he was the most frugal person she had ever met. He could probably live off $300 a month. He got rental money from a house in Tulsa. And y'all, that is Annette's house that he fucking stole from her. One day she tried to step across the swollen creek in front of her house, knocked off her feet. She got dragged downstream, and she said, if I had died in the creek, I would have been added to the list of people that Felix supposedly killed. And she actually brings up a good point there. It would have been another strange death, and she's using that as a example of how that shit can happen. I don't buy it. She knew of the allegations that Vail had something to do with Annette Vail's disappearance, but she was unaware of Sharon Hensley's disappearance or the suspicions surrounding Mary Horton. That man, she insisted, was not the man I know. So let's get into after that article I told you about Gone was written by Jerry Mitchell. And I'm going to pick up with his account of that. He starts trying to find Vail himself in 2012. And he finds out that where Vail was living, he had sold all his acreage. He had like 17 acres from his parents, and he showed up there and there was just a storm damaged trailer, etc. But no contents whatsoever in that trailer. So he calls Vail's brother Ronnie, and Vail's brother Ronnie said, I don't know where he went. He probably doesn't want anyone to know where he is. Ronnie, who had worked for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for 22 years, told him that when he had heard the allegations of the disappearances of these women, he was as shocked as anybody else. So the reporter asked him, did the FBI ever interview you? No, and I'm surprised they haven't, he said. And then he picks up, after my story on Felix Vail Gone appeared in the Clarion Ledger on November 11th, 2012, I traveled to Montpelier to meet a man who had telephoned me. Wesley Turnage grew up with Vail and recalled a conversation he had in the months following his 1963 graduation from high school. He said he had car trouble one day and Vail gave him a ride to the Knickerbocker Manufacturing Company in nearby West Point, where they both worked. During that drive, he said Vail talked first of his son Bill and then of his deceased wife Mary, calling her his ex-wife, a word that kind of stuck with Turnage as strange since the two were not divorced at the time of her death. He said the longer Vail spoke, the angrier he got. You could see the rage in his eyes. Vail referred to Mary as a bitch, saying that she thought another child would help solve her marriage problems, Turnage recalled. He quoted Vail as saying she wanted to have another kid. I didn't want the one I got, I told her. I fixed that sorry bitch. She'll never have another one. Time marched on, but he said he never forgot what Vail told him. It's like 9/11, he said. Some things just stick in your mind. So the reporter returned to Lake Charles, puzzled by how Vail dodged an indictment in that 1962 death of his wife. Her brother Will Horton joined me in the Calcasieu clerk's office as I poured through stacks of records, trying to find out more information about the grand jury that met on the case. Flipping through the pages, I noticed a lot of criminal cases had been dismissed in 1962. When I added them up, I realized the district attorney had the judge dismiss 882 cases, which were more than 3 cases for each working day. Mary's brother told me the original detectives in the case told him that the judge would not allow them to present evidence that they had collected against Vail. That matched the stories I'd heard from the grand jury's families. Mary's brother left while I continued to dig. A half hour later, he called me to let me know he was talking with District Attorney John DeRosa. He's from Eunice, just like me, Horton said. I walked over and met DeRosa, a Vietnam veteran. He viewed himself as the guy wearing the white hat and battling the bad guys. He even kept a life-size cutout of John Wayne in his office. He said he would be willing to reopen the case if there was enough evidence. Afterwards, I telephoned a retired lawyer who had known Frank Salter Jr., who was the then district attorney in 1963. The cheerful, white-haired man who built boats and model airplanes greeted Horton and me at the door and invited us to join him at the kitchen table. A talented attorney in both civil and criminal court, Russell Tritico Sr. had won a 1980 civil judgment forcing chainsaw manufacturers to put chain brakes on their products. The 84-year-old retired lawyer recalled the corruption of those days. He worked back then under his Uncle Joe, who represented the then sheriff, Ham Reed, accused of taking bribes but never convicted. Tritico said the sheriff was so paranoid he stayed in his patrol car and he never answered the telephone at home unless he heard the right sequence of rings. He described Salter as a longtime prosecutor whose close friends were mostly what I called hoodlums. In the 1950s, Salter began his legal career as an assistant DA for then District Attorney Ed Shannon. When the senior prosecutor sought re-election in 1960, Salter ran against him. Tritico said the major issue Salter raised was Shanahan had just dismissed too many cases. Then Frank became DA and he does the same thing. Dismissals became business as usual and defense lawyers showered office secretaries with gifts, especially at Christmas, he recalled. It was easy money. Of course, the victim might not be happy. He knew about the 1962 death of Mary Horton Vail. When his Uncle Joe ran against Salter in 1966, her death became a political issue. The candidate showed a photograph of her body after it was recovered from the river as proof of Salter's political favor. I asked Tritico about the city's service, and he told me the company was like the General Motors of the Lake Charles, Louisiana area. I knew Vail's uncle, Thomas Finney, had worked there as a supervisor and had arranged for Vail's job. In searching for Salter's obituary, I had run across the one for his father, who had also worked at city service. When I visited Vinny's 94-year-old widow, Virginia, she confirmed the couple's friendship with the district attorney. I shared what Vail said about trout line fishing that night, and Tritico shook his head. The longtime fisherman questioned why Vail would have traveled so many miles up the Calcasieu River when he could have laid trout lines not far from where he kept his boat. You just don't run trout lines in deep water, he said. So where had Felix Vail gone? He had just disappeared like the women he professed to once love. I telephoned more of his relatives and friends. They were just as clueless as me. Weeks after Gone was published, I received a telephone call from a man who had read my nearly 9,000-word story online. We discussed Vail, the case against him, and his disappearance before the man volunteered. I know where he is. You do? Canyon Lake, Texas, he said. Would you like his P.O. box? You bet, I said. Back in Jackson, I telephoned Ensign Yasik of Boston, the founder of the Serial Homicide Expertise and Information Sharing Collaborative. That's a mouthful. No matter what questions I had about serial killers, he had the answers, thanks to a huge database he had amassed. My search for answers in the Vail case led Yasik to contact Armin Showalter, acting chief for the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which specialized in serial homicide investigations. He also shared a copy of Gone with Showalter, who in turn contacted Calcasieu Parish Deputy Randy Curtis, now taking on the Vail case. Curtis telephoned me explaining that he was a 20-year law enforcement veteran who had been transferred from the Violent Crimes Unit to the Forensic Cold Case Division. After reading Gone, he called me back, wondering if I knew where Vail was these days. Canyon Lake, Texas, I said. Days later, the deputy telephoned with news that the FBI had discovered Vail purchased property on Shady View Drive in Canyon Lake, and on January 18th of 2013, Curtis decided to confront Vail. He found the suspected serial killer at that address, living in a storage shed so large that it could be a home. Curtis said he read Vail his rights before asking him about the death and disappearances of the women, and Vail refused to say anything, accusing families and the Clarion Ledger of lying about him. The whole time, Vail couldn't stop smirking, and that's his major arrogance, y'all. The sight of that smirk it angered Curtis, who worked days, nights, and weekends on that case. One day, he called me to tell me he found something big. And not long after this call, Will Horton shared the number of his cousin, who was in the same rosary group with a caretaker for 90-year-old Isaac Sonny Abshire. I drove to Lake Charles and sat down with the man, who was finishing his lunch in front of the television. He remembered Vail well. The pair had worked together at a chemical plant next to the City Service Refinery in nearby Sulphur, Louisiana. Abshire described Vail as my helper and a good worker. I liked him. Vail was looking for a place closer to his girlfriend, Mary Horton, who was living in Lake Charles. Needing the cash, Abshire offered him a room for rent. He accepted, and Mary became a frequent visitor. I was kind of like a big brother to her, he said. She was a sweet little girl. After the couple decided to get married, Vail moved out. At work, his disposition soured. He talked about how ugly his wife was when she was pregnant and that he didn't like his baby. Even a dog loves their children, Abshire said. On the Friday before drowning, the couple visited, bringing their infant son, Bill. Mary confided in Abshire, asking if he thought Vail could take her baby away. 2 nights later, word came that Mary had drowned in the Calcasieu River. Deputies contacted Abshire's father to help in the search. So Abshire and 2 fellow workers, they went out the next day to drag the river. The next morning, October 30th, 1962, he returned with one of them, Jimmy May, to continue dragging. While they're talking, something popped up. A guy with binoculars asked, "Does she have blonde hair?" I said, "Yes, that's her." They recovered the body, and Abshire could not forget what he saw. Her body was rigid, and a scarf was wrapped around her neck before going into her mouth. It had a big old knot in it, he said. The deputies on the boat boiled in anger, all voicing the same opinion. Vail had killed Mary. They believed it was foul play just by looking at the body. A deputy shared copies of the photographs taken that day, and Abshire had held on to them ever since, placing them in a folder he marked "Keep." "You hung on to these photos for 50 years, I asked. "Yes," he replied. He told me he gave the photos to Deputy Curtis. He also handed over a copy of the 1962 sheriff's report, which listed 15 points suggesting Vail's guilt. Despite being behind on major bills, Vail had managed to pay an entire year's premiums in advance for a $50,000 life insurance policy on his wife. He had a second life insurance policy on her for $8,000, which promised to pay double if she died by accident. Deputies reported that witnesses said Vail told them he didn't love his wife and that she was stupid and she looked vulgar. Deputies also reported that Vail had sexual relationships with other females and at least one male. Most witnesses they talked to felt like he was capable of killing his wife. Vail told deputies that his wife was wearing an off-white leather jacket when she went into the water, but she wasn't wearing the jacket when her body was recovered. Inside his boat, deputies found 2 life preservers. Mary had not been wearing one, despite her fear of drowning. As for that trout line, deputies found it coiled inside Vail's tackle box. That's why, Abshire told me, that's why they thought it was fishy. When he returned to work, he told his co-workers what he witnessed. Word spread, and he said his boss hauled him in and told him to stop sharing what he saw. Eventually, Abshire faced off with Vail. He said he had lawyers that were ready to sue me for everything I had, for all I was saying about him. "Get your lawyer ready," I told him. "I want to get on the witness stand and tell everybody what had happened." After some time passed, Abshire said Vail telephoned him asking if he still wanted to tell everything to the lawyers. "Get 'em," Abshire said he replied, "I'm still ready to talk. I want to get on the stand and tell him what I know." Not long after, Vail left town. I asked him if he believed Vail had killed his wife. "Oh, my God, yes," he said. I then met with Steve Horton, who talked about his Aunt Mary, whom his family adored so much that he and his wife had named their daughter after her. He showed me her 1962 death certificate signed by the coroner, Dr. Harry Snaddock. The certificate said she fell from the boat while fishing and accidentally drowning. Horton detailed the many errors Snaddock had put down. The wrong date of her birth, for example, the wrong date of her death, the wrong occupation. He pointed to the neat signature, William Vail. It looked nothing like the handwriting William Felix Vail typically had. He then directed me to the date of Vail's signature, October 31st of 1962. That was the same day of the funeral, he said, which was in Eunice. How could he have signed this in Lake Charles? Horton shared other documents which showed Vail had failed to pay any money towards the $1,014 bill for his wife's funeral, or her headstone, or even her burial plot. "Dear sir, I would have contacted you sooner if I would have known anything definite about when I can pay you," Vail wrote Audubon's funeral home in 1963. "Thank you for your patience, and I'll be in your office in the first part of April to settle the bill. Yours truly, Felix Vail." Vail never paid, despite receiving thousands on 2 life insurance policies that he took out on Mary. The funeral home won a judgment of $1,306 in Mississippi against Vail, and he still didn't pay. It was during a bridge game in 1969 that Mary's mother learned Vail had never put a penny towards the funeral. She was so embarrassed, she went in and paid it herself. I spoke with the funeral home operator, Gene Ordorn. He remembered Mary as a beautiful girl. They had a marriage not made in heaven, but made in hell, he said. So I decided to take a trip to Canyon Lake. And when I drove into the Canyon Lake neighborhood where Vail lived, I saw a deer grazing the lawns. Paperwork I copied at the courthouse prior to my trip showed David Thomason had deeded his property to Vail after he paid the back taxes. So I dug into Thomason's background, and I discovered that he and Vail shared something in common. Each of those guys had a wife who died in an accidental drowning. So I decided to dig deeper. Thomason's estranged wife, Kathy, she had drowned in Canyon Lake. This was on July 3rd of 2005. Her family still had questions. Her mother, Kathy Simon, who still lived in Canyon Lake, told me her daughter tried to get away from Thomason, who was charged twice with assault but never prosecuted. She was terrified of him. On the back lot of Vail's property, I could see the boat Kathy supposedly fell from and drowned. Friends told me Thomason was out of town at the time. If he did take out a life insurance policy on her, I couldn't find it, but I did find insurance companies shelled out more than $500,000 in proceeds to him, including $215,000 for a house fire that the fire marshal thought was suspicious. Vail now lived on this property. When I pulled up outside his home, I noticed there were no windows. The padlocked fence had barbed wire across the top. I called out his name and told him I was interested in speaking with him about the missing women. There was no answer. On March 10th of 2013, I received an email from someone by the name of Gina Fretzel, a red-headed private investigator whose colleagues nicknamed her Batgirl. She was obsessed with serial killers. She had already read the ebook version of Gone before going online to discover Felix Vail was now living in Canyon Lake. That was only an hour and a half away from her home in Kerrville, Texas, where her grandfather had been chief of police for 20 years. "I'm a licensed PI," she wrote me. "Let me know if you need any help." I promised I would. Later, I sent a second email saying I'd like to find out more about the suspicious burning of David Thomason's house on the property where Vail now lived. On April 3rd, she tried to talk to Thomason, and when she was unable to, she telephoned and said she was going to see Vail. "He won't talk to you," I told her. "Want to bet?" She called back later with the news that Vail had indeed talked. She told him she was an investigator looking into the Thomason fire, and he had spoken almost nonstop to her. She returned several more times, recording each of her conversations with Vail, who shared details about his life and lectured her about the dangers of ego, even as his own ego overwhelmed their conversations. He told her he had a genius-level IQ surpassing 140 and talked of memories from the wound, saying he could feel the sunshine on his mother's belly. Wow. I shared the information from Frenzel's visits with the expert Yazik. He provided many more hours of advice and insight, saying Vail seemed more in line with a cult leader than a suspected serial killer. For more than a dozen hours, Vail spouted off to Frenzel about diet. He talked about his adventures, which included motorcycling with a Dutch woman across the U.S. and bicycling with a teenage boy across California. Vail regaled her with stories of his sexual exploits, having talked of having sex with hundreds, maybe even thousands of women, before adding that he didn't consider himself promiscuous. He asked her to have sex. She told him no, that she didn't know him well enough to have sex, and I knew that was coming. By now, Frenzel had begun to play the role of Vail's girlfriend, despite the fact that they had never even kissed. The conversations grew darker. He talked about how much he knew about killing people, murdering, pain, incapacitating people. He said he and Thomason had enough anonymity that we are held in suspicion by all of our family and friends for being able to think of something and do it without looking at whether it's legal or not, or permissible by society or not. He talked of eating live raw meat, saying if you're going to eat animals, you would have to kill them and drink the blood, suck it out of the body and drink it right then. That would be live meat. After Vail talked about a young woman who was obviously a net, Frenzel asked him if he had talked to her since. His eyes got huge, she told me. It was the most evil look I've ever seen. 11 days after Frenzel first contacted me, Vail's sister, Kay Faulkner, telephoned, distraught about her younger brother. "Ronnie's dying," she said. I replied that I was sorry to hear that. His body had been ravaged for years by the hepatitis C he contracted during the Vietnam War. A liver transplant had saved his life a dozen years earlier, but now his second liver was failing. Faulkner told me it was her birthday and that she would never forget this day. She began weeping. I know God has a plan, but why couldn't he take Felix instead? After our conversation, I spoke with Mary Rose, mentioning it was Faulkner's birthday. "It's my birthday too," she said. I had no idea Kay and I shared the same birthday. We talked about the case against Felix Vail, and she was worried that authorities might do nothing. Ever since Vail had sold his Mississippi property, she had been wondering if he would also sell his Tulsa property she and Annette had once owned. Weeks later, she called with the news that Vail had sold that Tulsa house. The sale price online, $149,000. Now that he has all this money, do you think he's going to run, Jerry? "I don't know," I replied. "He could be running." On April 30th, my telephone rang that Felix Vail had now left Texas. His sister told me that he had shown up the previous morning at the Columbus, Mississippi home of their late brother, Ronnie, who had died 5 weeks earlier. Vail had skipped the funeral. When Ronnie's widow, Bonnie, spotted Vail, she went to a relative's employer, called police, and told them that she didn't want to talk to him. A worker told Vail to move on. That afternoon, Calcasieu Parish Deputy Randy Curtis called me with more news. Vail had returned to his brother's property again, this time when Bonnie was gone. Neighbors spotted him checking her mailbox, then hopping a fence and circling her house. Columbus police and other law enforcement officials found Vail in a white pickup and pulled him over. He told them he had come there for a funeral before heading to Montpelier. Curtis said Columbus police were sending him a photograph of Vail and his truck, and he could be running, Jerry. "I know," I replied. Vail's sister telephoned again, saying she heard her brother was heading to Montpelier. She wondered if he was driving to the home of possible witness Wesley Turnage. I called Turnage to let him know that Vail might be headed his way. If he sets foot on my property, Turnage said, there ain't going to be a trial. He called me back later saying no one in Montpelier had seen Vail. Are the authorities ever going to do anything? I think so. Well, they better get moving, he said. In his last conversation with his dying brother, Vail had confided to Ronnie, a one-time missionary in the Philippines, what he experienced preaching as a teenager at the Montpelier Baptist Church, seeing a divine being that shimmered like the sun. It was a bad mistake, Vail recalled, because he was thinking I was touched by a demon. I called Frenzel, who speculated that Vail's visit has to do with something his brother had, and he wants it now that his brother's dead. Whatever it is, Felix is willing to risk going to Mississippi and breaking into a place to get it. He didn't even risk going to the funeral. So where's Vail now? Columbus police didn't know. The sheriff's office in Lake Charles didn't know. Even his family didn't know. Frenzel said Vail had talked about living in Switzerland. Could this be the last goodbyes before leaving? At 10:30 p.m., Frenzel telephoned. I'm sorry to be calling so late. It's okay. I'm up, I said. She talked of the journals she had seen that Vail was keeping in the plastic bins. She had been unable to read them so far, but she had taken photographs of the back sides of the pages. She shared the photos with a computer expert who analyzed them, spotting these words on the same line: wife, attic, and divided. Could Vail have given his brother something to keep? Perhaps stuffed something in the attic? The next morning, I spoke with Deputy Curtis. He said Bonnie had given the police permission to search her property in case Vail had hid something there. That search, I told him, should include the attic. He called back later to say the search had turned up nothing. Each day, I made a round of calls, and each day no one had heard from Vail. 6 days later, Frenzel called. Vail had just left her a message saying he was back in Canyon Lake. Hallelujah! He didn't leave the country. I telephoned Randy Curtis with the news that Vail was in Canyon Lake, and he sounded relieved. I talked with Frenzel again. She was anxious to confront Vail about the missing women. She was also anxious to stop playing the role of his girlfriend. But before she could, authorities arrested Vail, charging him with the murders of his first wife, Mary. After that May 17th arrest, Vail wrote Frenzel letters telling her he loved her. In telephone calls from jail in Lake Charles, he shared his explanation of what happened that night on October 28, 1962, on the Calcasieu River. He referred to his first wife as a coon-ass lady, saying she was half kneeling on his feet when she saw one of his float buckets that were on the line. He said the boat was going real slow along the edge of the bank when the boat hit a stump and it dumped her right out. Vail said he shut off the motor and jumped in, where she had plopped into the water and the river had sucked her right in. He said, I dove around until I was exhausted and came in immediately to the police station in town and reported the accident. And that was it. This story differed greatly from his story in 1962 when he said his wife was sitting on top of a boat seat when she fell out, and not that she was kneeling on his feet. Back then, he said nothing about hitting a stump, just swerving to miss it. Vail told Frenzel that the case has been an avalanche coming down a mountain all that time, waiting to hit my head, and it finally has. He blamed the families and me, an evil, shrimpy reporter, for what had happened, called the charges fabricated, and insisted that a large amount of money, hate, and political ambition is behind it. At Vail's request, Frenzel returned his truck to his home and went inside to take care of a few tasks. While there, she spent 16 hours photographing all of his journals, more than 2,400 pages. She also photographed letters, documents, photographs, and business cards, some dating back to the 60s. She found a hodgepodge of women's jewelry, old buttons and pins, and even a glass dildo. Most disturbingly, she found a photograph of a naked 3-year-old girl. Frenzel later spoke with the girl, who is now a woman, and the journals revealed that Vail had stalked her for years. Frenzel discovered the birth certificate of Annette Craver Vail, who had used it for previous trips to Mexico. Obviously, she didn't take that with her. One of her oddest findings was someone else's birth certificate, a man named Henry Curtis Ware III. 2 weeks after Vail's arrest, I telephoned public defender Andrew Cassanet. The former prosecutor returned my calls and asked what I wanted. "Are you Felix Vail's lawyer?" For now, why are you calling me? I explained that I had been working on a story on Vail, having a DNA test in connection with a 1990 double homicide in Starkville, Mississippi, where 2 elderly women were raped and killed. The crime struck me as the work of someone else. "A double homicide?" he asked. He explained that the Starkville police had just swabbed the inside of Vail's cheeks, testing his DNA. He said he hardly knew anything about Vail's case from the district attorney because the DA had been too busy talking to the press. I laughed. "You must be the investigative reporter mentioned in the arrest warrant." "Yep, that's me," I said. "I knew it had to be you." "Why?" I said. "You're the only one who's called me. This killing happened all the way in Louisiana. Why are you covering it in Mississippi?" "Well, it's where Felix Vail was born and where he was living before he took off," I said. "Took off? Sometimes people just leave. If I'm in high school and I go to college, I just leave." "Yes," I replied. "Do you need anything else?" "Nope," I replied. So Frenzel and I then plowed through Vail's journals, noticing gaps that made us believe he had purged them. Times when he would have been with Sharon and Annette appeared to have been destroyed. Throughout his journals, his main topic was sex, describing his exploits of women, single and married, straight and lesbian, conscious and unconscious. Even as he hopped from bed to bed, he demanded monogamy, referring to women as whores. Sex dominated his dreams, where women from his past often appeared as characters. The journals also reflected an obsession with children. In a March 27, 1986 entry, Vail described the visit of a woman and her daughters in his home. "The little girls were delicious," he wrote. "We massaged some, hugged and kissed some, and it was 12 midnight and time for them to go." Sick fucker. On August 29th, 1992, Vail walked into the Walmart in West Point, and a 1-year-old white girl looked in my eyes, loving me as if there were no age difference between us. Good grief. On July 6th of 2013, Frenzel emailed me something she spotted in the photographs of Vail's wife, Mary, taken after her body was discovered in the Calcasieu River. It looks like her panties are pulled out over the top of her jeans in the small of her back. To me, this would be a sign of a struggle. No woman on the planet would allow that to happen with her panties. I think it was a situation where he grabbed for her jeans for leverage and her panties slipped over the waistband. In the other photograph, her Chi Omega sweatshirt was bunched up and her midriff was exposed. Her sleeve cuffs looked as if grease had been ground into them. The autopsy report showed she had a big bruise on the back of her head. Could she have been struck from behind and then dragged, the full weight of her body grinding the grease into her cuffs? That same day, Vail's sister, Beth Keys, died of a massive heart attack. Her obituary was an impressive one. Valedictorian of her high school, successful realtor, and generous philanthropist. Her obituary listed all of her siblings, dead and living, with one exception, Felix Vail. A day later, fellow journalist Stanley Nelson emailed me the name of a man I should speak with. The next day, I interviewed 58-year-old Kurt Germany of Saucier, Mississippi, who had worked alongside Vail in 1977. Although Vail was aloof, he just seemed to have a strange mind control, trying to bring people into his world in a manipulative sense, Germany said. He just had that Charles Manson personality. No matter where they went, Vail attracted women. Felix claimed he was locked in a Bavarian love knot with this woman, Germany said. Something like 18 hours. What the hell is that? He said Vail also remarked that the best sex he had ever had was with either, get this is sick, a 2 or 3 year old girl. In fall of 2013, I telephoned Lee Peck, a reporter for KPLC TV in Lake Charles, who had aired several stories on Vail. He had told me before that one of their part-time employees was working for Travelers Insurance when they sold Vail the $50,000 life insurance policy on his wife, Mary. This time, Peck gave me her name, Jacine Brooks, whose telephone number I found online. She answered the call and said she remembered the death well. It was, she said, the first time she had ever read an autopsy. She described Vail as cold and unemotional in his dealings. Deputies told her they knew he had killed his wife, but they couldn't prove it. She said Vail's wife did not sign the policy, and she needed to sign it. The agent got in a little trouble. Despite being the major breadwinner, Vail didn't take out a policy on himself. The insurance company wound up settling the claim. I was surprised he got anything, Brooks said, because she had not signed it. Frenzel and I tracked down Kurt Ware, who was stunned to learn that a copy of his birth certificate had been found in Vail's home. The copy had been ordered in January of 1973. Had Vail ordered that birth certificate? And if so, why? Was he going to adopt this as his new identity? Ware didn't recognize the name Felix Vail, but he did recognize Vail and his girlfriend Sharon Hensley after I emailed him photographs. He said he had met them in 1972, possibly at the health food place where he worked in New Orleans. In his journals, Vail had written that they went by the aliases Joseph and Helene Martin, and had even married under those names. Ware said those names did ring a bell. He also said he and Vail bore a physical resemblance to each other and would often hang out together on Saturdays. He recalled Vail entering a wine store, removing the sticker from the most expensive wine and replacing it with a sticker from the cheapest. He would literally spend $3 and come out with the best wine, he said. Aloof and intriguing, Vail talked about grape fast, where he ate only grapes, Ware said, and he only drank this German wine made from white grapes. During one conversation, he said Vail asked him, "Have you ever killed someone?" He felt a chill. The way he said it made me think he had killed somebody in his past. I tracked down Dick White, who recalled Vail visiting him and his wife for a month in their Texas home in 1993. While working on a roof, Vail accidentally hit his finger with a hammer. He said Vail then argued with his injured finger. "You ain't hurting, you son of a bitch. I'll make you hurt." Vail swung the hammer and smashed his finger a second time. During their work together on several projects, including building a barn, White said Vail told him, "My ego wants to talk to you." White said he replied, "Felix, I'm not dealing with you in the third person." White said Vail drifted in and out of different levels of sanity and insanity. Talk of mental illness didn't surprise him. "I knew Vail's late father suffered from bipolar disorder," he said. Vail often watched television shows on schizophrenia, a popular topic in his journals. He told Frenzel he believes the whole human species is schizo. And y'all, that's where I am going to cut it off today. And we should be able, the next episode, we'll wrap this up. It's about to really get into it because we're about to get into the court testimony. But it's very important that I give you the history of what was going on prior to that, so you can see how sick and disgusting this asshole is. So I thank you so much for listening. Again, happy Thanksgiving. I hope you're spending it with family and friends and loved ones, and I am sure thankful for all of you. And until next time, I'm Jim Chapman, your host of Bloody Angola, a podcast 142 years in the making, the complete story of America's bloodiest prison. Peace.
I walk a straight line, shackled and chained. Oh, gruesome Gertie is calling my name. There is no mercy in this penitentiary. Just ask the Hill String Gang or Angola 3.